Welcome, everyone, to Women on the Military podcast. I'm excited to have JT here. She has an interesting story. I've been reading about you before this interview, so I'm really excited to do this interview. And welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So I always like to start with, why did you decide to join the military? So let's go back to that point and remember, why did you want to join the military?
That's an interesting question because I can't say that I really was thinking about that. It was kind of a chance encounter. I was at a tennis tournament in Kentucky and I got recruited to play tennis for the United States Military Academy. And at the time, I think I've always had this fantasy of being in the uniform, but when I went, I wasn't really thinking about war because we were in a time of peace.
Yeah. Yeah, I was looking because you graduated in 2000. So the
Right.
whole time you were at West Point as a time of peace. And I mean, the whole military changed very quickly after you commissioned. So what was it like to be at West Point at a time of peace? Like, was it, I mean, I'm sure it was still super intense training, but what was the whole experience like?
It definitely, you are thrown into a bowl where, you might have been pretty confident about things that you're doing in your life, but then all of a sudden, you feel like a speck. I mean, I'm sure not everyone felt that way, but for myself, I was used to being a tennis champion. I was used to being good at all sports. And it has a way of breaking you down to the most stressful situations. I guess they do that intentionally to build you back up. But I honestly, if I wasn't on the tennis team, I don't know if I would ever go through with it, because at least being an athlete, you could have those moments to get away from the hell.
Yeah, because you were an athlete, so you had like the military stuff, but then you also had, being an athlete. Did you guys travel to different tournaments and
Yeah.
that sort of? Yeah.
Yeah, we were on the road pretty often during season. Yeah.
So that gave you a nice little break.
At least, yeah, which was much needed during freshman year or plebe year, as we say.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting to hear, like that, I always thought of like sports as like extra work, which, because there is a lot of, you have practice and you have all this, but then it's also a break because it's something different and probably something that you love.
Exactly. It's more like a stress release. And yeah, I mean, it definitely was very time consuming because we would have practice for like 2 hours when, you're stressing about studying and exams the next day, or duties for the upperclassmen because they're going to haze you. And they like to find those athletes when we did get back to the barracks, that's for sure, to make up for all the time lost.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. So what was your career field that you picked when you graduated? Well, I mean, it's before graduation, but whatever you went into when you graduated.
So it's kind of funny because if I hadn't have gone to West Point, I really wanted actually to go to art school, to Savannah College of Art and Design, but my mom was not about to pay for an art career, and there's no tennis scholarships to this art school. So West Point is a very technical engineering school, and everyone has to pick a track of engineering, but I picked the most creative thing I could think of, and that was foreign languages was my major, because I imagined just traveling the world and on peacekeeping missions, and I wanted to be stationed overseas. Not in the way that it maybe turned out, but didn't end up using Spanish or German much.
Right. So you got your degree in foreign language, and then what
Yep.
did that turn into a career field in the Army?
Nothing. I mean, what you major in at West Point doesn't necessarily figure into what you're going to do in the Army. But I chose to be in an engineer unit, and at the time, women could only be in combat heavy engineering units, and I know that changed shortly after I think I graduated. They could be in light engineering units, but I wanted to be an engineer. One, because I didn't have the grades to be a doctor or go medical or be a pilot. But two, I felt like this was the most creative path I could take. And doing something tangible, building something, creating something, because engineers build. And they're the ones who go in after wars and on peacekeeping missions to rebuild. So that's kind of what I had in my mind.
Yeah. I mean, my background's civil engineering, and I never really thought about that being creative, but it is. I mean, engineering
Yep.
is creative. You are creating things.
Yeah. Yeah. I didn't want to be one of those officers that sat behind a desk shuffling papers. And I know that a lot of officers' roles are that. But if you are in a unit that is doing something else, like engineers, like I could be on the ground with them more and just get my hands dirty, which is the kind of person I am. I'm not a paper shuffler.
Yeah.
I can't stand it.
Yeah. So you ended up in engineering. And then do you go to Bullock for first when you commission? Is that what you?
No,
Or is
we
it,
go to OBC in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri for engineer officer basic training.
okay. And then how long is that training?
God, my memory is pretty bad, but I think it was about was it
Approximately.
3 months, 4 months, something like that.
Okay. And so okay, so that's like fall, winter of 2000 is when you would get to your first assignment?
Yeah, you're asking great questions of memory here. So when I remember correctly, because I do remember this, I got to my first duty station in November of 2000. So
Okay.
yes.
Okay, so you had about almost a year of being in the Army before September, like in the real Army, doing your job before September 11th happened. So your what was your job in that almost year period?
I was immediately put into a platoon leader position, and I had the same platoon for that entire time. It was a vertical construction. So I had plumbers, electricians, carpenters. It was pretty cool.
Yeah.
And we were, besides mostly just training, like most people in the Army do during peacetime, we actually were actively building things on the base using our engineering, our construction skills to
Right.
build like new barracks facilities, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that sounds really fun. That's very similar to, civil engineering in the Air Force. So,
And we definitely get those civil engineers when they come to our battalions. Like civil engineers want to be in a construction battalion so they can become the S3C, which
yeah.
is the engineer.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. No, it sounds like a great fit. And so then September 11th happens, and what was that day like?
So I was on leave actually in New Orleans visiting home on September 11th. I remember my mom is the one who like finally had a day to sleep in from duty, and she comes charging into the room and turning the TV on. I think that for a lot of us, it's a big cloud because it's the day that everything changed and when you can't really remember what life was like before. But we were immediately called back to base, and they called me off of leave to come back. And from that moment, like literally, we were on lockdown. Like we already knew we were probably going to be deploying, and then we found out. I think the official first orders came down in October, right after the declaration against the war against terrorism.
And then you guys deployed really quick. You were in the first wave that deployed, right?
Yeah. The first Bravo company was gone before Thanksgiving. And we kept, it's like, the Army, hurry up and wait, right? They're like, so we couldn't take leave. We couldn't go anywhere because it's like any day it's coming, any day it's coming, any day it's coming. And then it was, I think, December when we got our orders, and I was out that like January 2nd or something. And I guess because we were going into a different part of Afghanistan, they were waiting for the airfield to be secured in Kandahar. And that's
Okay.
where they were kind of waiting to deploy us to go there.
So that was
Alpha
the
Company.
holdup because
I
you
think
guys were.
think so. Yeah, because Bravo went to, back then it was an undisclosed location. They were in between. Well, they were in a lot of places like Mazar-e Sharif, but they were in K2, Uzbekistan. because that was kind of like the staging area. And as soon as I guess it was clear for us to go to Kandahar, my company went to Kandahar, and one of our platoons actually went to Pakistan. Yeah, it was pretty crazy.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's really interesting to hear about the early days of both the Iraq and Afghanistan conflict, because by the time I went to Afghanistan, it was 2010. And so there was like this huge built up base at Bagram.
I can only, was my boxing ring still there by any chance?
I don't know.
My soldiers built me a boxing ring, and it started to be used by everyone at Bagram.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I wasn't stationed on Bagram, so I was only there for like little bits in time. But it was, I mean, like the main drive was called Disney, and it was 2 miles long of
Yeah.
just like all kinds of stuff, and like you could just walk forever. And so, and that was just like the main drive, and then there was like all this other stuff. So
yeah, it definitely wasn't like that. When we first got to Kandahar, it was, I guess that's why they send combat heavy engineers in first, to make an area for people to live in. So
right.
yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, I remember I was on the first chalk of my company landing in Kandahar. This is like, they were doing tactical landings. It was just crazy. But the first morning I'm walking, and there must have been no women there yet, because there's this guy and he's just like peeing right there on the road, like right in front of me. And he saw me. He's like, oh, maybe I should put that away. I guess women are here now. Special forces guy. Yeah.
He's like, oh, what are you doing here?
Yeah, exactly. He's like, oh, I guess we got to change. Yeah.
No, it changed a lot. It changed a lot. That's kind of funny. Yeah, because I interviewed someone who was in Iraq, and she's like, yeah, we were just like in these like, bombed out buildings that ended up being where we stayed, because that was all there was. And
exactly.
by the time I got there, it was like a city. So
yeah, it was like tents and the old buildings. Yeah. And we were, I'm sure you knew what our bathrooms were like. There were no porta potties, put it that way. We all had to stir the pot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, they had flushing toilets when I was there. So.
Wow.
There were porta potties too, but that sounds like a way upgrade. Porta potties and flushing toilets.
Porta potties was an upgrade if we could get those. Yes, they did have those in Uzbekistan, because I was actually in 3 places. I was in all 3. Okay. Kandahar was just my point 1.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, it makes sense that you guys would be in there because of the role that you were doing and the work that you needed to do. And
yeah,
that was kind of what you wanted to do, but more in like a peacekeeping role, not a war zone.
Yeah, I wasn't imagining building prisoner facilities like that. But one of the very cool things that we were doing, though, was repairing the runways. And that was a primary work there, was making them paved to be able to withhold C-5s, because at the time it could only be, the heaviest aircraft was a C-17 that could land. And imagine like a whole engineering company, just a company. You have like, it took 20 C-17s or more to get all of us and our equipment there and then back, because you just put like a couple containers, a dozer, and like 5 people on one. And then you got to wait for the next one and the next one. So it's pretty crazy. I think that was the first time an engineering unit did an air move in a war deployment like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and to think about like how much bigger a C-5 is compared to a C-17, and how much easier. Yeah. So it was really important to get that runway, fixed and ready to go.
Yeah. And then our other soldiers, our earth movers, were doing a lot of mine clearing as well, using up-armored, we called it MCAP. So basically our dozers would detonate the mines, clear them. So that's almost peacekeeping, except we were only doing it in our little area of making a base camp for future forces.
Yeah, I mean, they were still mining mines when I was at Bagram. Like, that's how they would open up new areas for people to live, was they
Yeah.
would, like, do all the mines. So, like, that was still happening years later because there were so many mines.
And it will continue, yeah, for probably years.
Yeah. So, yeah, so how long were you in Afghanistan then?
8 months?
Okay. And then you came back
7 or
and
8, yeah.
okay.
Yeah, we came back. There was some whispering about Iraq before we even got home. It was starting to, I remember the first TV we got finally in our talk tent in Bagram, and it was like all this was happening with weapons of mass destruction and Bush. And I just remember one of our senior NCOs, he's like, I guarantee you, ma'am, we'll be there within the year. We're going. He's like, just wait. He was right. We got back, and a couple months later, we knew we were going again.
So was that stressful to be like, back-to-back deployments, or was it just the ops tempo at the time?
I thought it was stressful. I mean, yeah, we had just gotten back from Afghanistan, and you kind of felt like it was time to have a little, I guess, like R&R. And to be honest with you, like, I wasn't so sure what I thought about our mission in Iraq, to be honest. But, you don't always have a choice when you're in the service, and, but you find other things, even if you don't necessarily believe in like the overall mission, you still find a way as a leader to take care of your soldiers, and you find your own purpose that's worth it, especially when it comes to like being a good image for our country, because there are many soldiers in the military, unfortunately, that don't have enough maybe training or cultural training even about the lands that we go into, and some of those people make a really bad perception of America and Americans. So you can always find good in every deployment, even if you don't think you understand what the real mission is.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
didn't seem like we were trying to free Iraqis, that's for sure. Because they called it that in the beginning. When we went, it was Operation Iraqi Freedom, and then they changed it. No, they changed it. It was Enduring Freedom, and then he changed it to Iraqi Freedom, like in the middle of it. And I was like, yeah. And it was strange to me because I didn't feel like we were doing that. At least what I was seeing, we were just, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I think there was like very little cultural training, and a lot, even when I was deployed to Afghanistan, we were building these like 2-story schoolhouses next to these mud huts. And it was like, maybe someone should have thought
That's
about
what I wanted to do in the Army, what you were doing.
So, I mean, we had contractors, we weren't actually building it, but it was like we were hiring these Afghan contractors to build these 2 stories with electricity and with like all these things that they had no idea how to use. I mean, generators would break because they'd put water in them. That's
wow.
kind of
right.
It's broken. What'd you put in it? Water.
Oops.
And so like we had these like cultural disconnects of like stuff that we were forcing onto the Afghan people, and then and that's just an example of like engineering wise, but then like think about all the cultural things that we were pushing, and not even realizing how disrespectful we were being because the cultures.
Yeah, there isn't enough of it. I didn't think we had enough of it in Afghanistan either, because I felt like I was learning everything from the NCOs when I was on the ground, and they were kind of teaching me about the history. And of course, I learned so much more later in life, just once starting my work in Ukraine, because that's all connected as well,
Yeah, I mean, I spent 4 months doing training, which was like we did this whole like 2-week culture thing where we learned the language and we learned like all this stuff, and I was like, that was great, but I still feel like it was not nearly enough, but it gave us like a solid foundation.
Yeah.
But so many people didn't get that. and especially in the early days. And
Yeah.
that was only because I was on a PRT, and so that was the special training that we got. But yeah.
Yeah, like I
So
definitely had one of the most shocking experiences I think for me in Iraq was like I definitely had this like preconceived notion, um, and the contractors that we were working with in Nasiriyah invited us to his personal home. We didn't, we just went. We weren't going to go ask for permission. But I was shocked when I went inside this home. Like I assumed it was going to be one way, and it could have been like any house in America. Really.
yeah. So you didn't even know, like, you had it in the mind what you expected, and then it was totally different.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I haven't been to Iraq, but I do know that Afghanistan wasn't really anything like what I expected, and I've had lots and lots of training. But some of it you can't learn until you're there. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And some of it you
So
can never learn without being a part of that culture, period. I mean, it's a limitation. And that's a hard part about when you are sent to war on another country's turf,
yeah,
that's not your own.
for sure. So were there any experiences from Iraq besides you mentioned going to the contractor's house that you want to highlight or share from your experience?
Something interesting. I can't really, off the top, say, except no, actually, there was this moment, and I write about this moment in my book. But one of my jobs was, besides going on the supply runs back and forth to Kuwait and back, was to go into the town and be the local purchaser, because we couldn't get supplies through the Army system yet because it was too early in the deployment. This is in April 2003. And so my comrade Karen and we were the two supply people, and we would take the Humvee and another Humvee and just go down into Nasiriyah. We would pick up this translator, and then we would go to the shop in the city. But this one time, we never really saw women ever. Like, it was always the men and the children coming up to the vehicles and just staring at especially women in uniform. They were like, wow. I remember my translator saying, why don't you have a husband? And I'm like, mind your own business, because I don't want one. You should be married. Oh, yeah. But this woman came to the vehicle. It was probably the first time I had seen one. And she just pushed all the men aside, and she just came up to me, and she was carrying this book. And I didn't know what it was at first, but it's just the way she was looking at me. I write this story so much better, but it was just this moment of complete understanding between two different cultures. We were just two humans just standing there. No uniforms, no abaya, that she was wearing. But anyway, the book was a translation book. It's like she was trying to speak with me. And then, of course, Yassir came back to the vehicle. He's like, get away from the car. And we zoomed off, and that was that. But it was definitely just this memorable moment of just understanding between two women, I guess you could say,
Yeah.
I wasn't being stared at just as a curiosity in that moment, but more like somebody wanting to understand what goes on for me. And I wanted to understand what her life was like. Of course, there would never be a discussion, but it was a beautiful moment. And I took a photograph too in this moment. And other moments weren't so great. You go down into the city, and then I remember just taking our safety for granted, because these were back when we didn't have the up armor or anything like that yet. We just drove into the city. We didn't have big authorization stuff to do. We just went. And this old man came out of the shop, and he started kind of chanting, and not chanting, but it sounded like he was preaching, and he was holding a Quran in one hand, and his voice was so powerful. And everyone in the street, the children that were surrounding us and playing with us, and it just all stopped. Everyone was only listening to this man. It's the only thing you can hear. Our translator tries to like start like rushing us like into the shop because you just felt like something was like going to happen. You didn't know, because in this moment after he was finished speaking, he started to speak in English, and he said, "Things should be the way they are. You should not be here." And all the people in the streets, they just started like cheering. And so I don't know how I ended up in the shop. I think somebody pushed me in there, like, because there was like a safety concern. I don't know, but I just remember that moment of feeling just this division of not, of even how they felt about our presence there. Like it wasn't one way or the other, or just that everything just turned so quickly. Like, because after he finished, they were cheering again, and like for us, like wanting to play with us, and like, how can they be like friendly with us if they agree with what he just said? It was a good reminder, that
Yeah.
I don't know anything about this place,
Yeah.
and we
That's really-
should know more.
Right. Yeah, we should know more, and we should listen to the people
Yeah.
who are there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow, that's really powerful. 2 like really powerful stories. Thank you so much for sharing them.
Sure.
So,
Much better at writing them than speaking them. So
Yep.
sorry.
Go get a book. That's
Yeah.
just advertisement for your book.
Yeah.
So did you deploy again while you were in the Army, or what?
No, after that, no. I was actually stop lost because our unit was put on orders again right after that. And I remember going to my battalion commander. I was getting ready to start. I had always planned to just do my 5 and get out. That was my plan. And I had been accepted to physical therapy school, which, by the way, I ended up not going just because I changed my mind. But I wanted to get started on these things. I just went to my battalion commander. I'm like, look, I've like really played my role. I'm tired. Please don't make me do this one. Just let me get out. But they kept me in until they kept me in an extra year. But I did not have to go with them. They had me training the new soldiers to send out to them. And the second they got it, actually, they let me go before the unit got home again. But it was a hard time because all my comrades were gone. They'd transferred or already left the Army. Yeah.
Yeah, and when you get stop loss, that means that like you're technically done with your commitment, but the Army's like, no.
Yeah.
You don't get to leave.
I felt like that was hard. I was like, I can't believe this is happening, like, yeah.
Yeah. And usually I've talked to someone who was stop loss, but she was in Iraq and like her time was up, and they were like, you have to stay here until the deployment's over, and then she was able to get out when she got home. So that's interesting that like you hadn't even left yet, and they're like, no, you have to like support this deployment.
Yeah. Yes, because they were saying if your unit is on orders to deploy, you're within like however many months you can't go. And I found out kind of like at the last minute. I was like, I can't believe this is happening. Yeah.
Yeah. And so then you were like the home party that was taking care of like the new people who came in.
I was the rear D commander. But it was a kind of a bigger situation this time because they were having such a hard time retaining people. I don't know if you remember this. This is like 2005. So they were doing this new thing. It was called rapid deployment. And they were bringing all kinds of like new soldiers, like training them very quickly, sending them to the units. And then we had to get them out to our battalion over there because it just we didn't have enough people. And remember 2005, people were dying a lot in Iraq. So it was like a lot. I don't remember how many soldiers that I received back home and sent to them, but it was a lot.
Yeah, my friend's husband was rear D, and then he kind of got penalized for not deploying, but he had so many like challenges with the people who, like you said, like there was so much going on, limited staff, so he was working like crazy hours, and like wasn't there for his family. And then they were like, kind of the Army gave a ding on him because he hadn't deployed. And it was like, but someone had to do this job, And so it was kind of interesting how, like, from her, like, hearing her side of the story, and he had deployed to Iraq. She talked about how difficult it was for him to be home, but not really home, and like getting calls at all hours in the night, and like
It's
all
a
kinds of
lot.
stuff.
Oh, and
Yeah.
lots of problems going on in that time, and especially our battalion a lot, because I guess we had been traveling so much. We'd have been deploying so much. Yeah. And it was like
Yeah.
our whole base too. Like, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Same for her and her husband. So then you were finally able to get out of the military. You had a plan, but then you changed your mind and ended up on a new path. So what did you end up doing?
So when I got out, well, first I was coaching tennis, because that was easy for me, but I had always wanted to be a writer. I always wanted to be a photographer. And I'm like, I think I was like, just somebody asked me to do their wedding for them or something, just a friend, because they're like, you're a good photographer. Okay. And I think it might have been my dad who always like encouraged my creative side. So I'm at work. He's like, you need to do something with this. I was like, okay, let me try. So it's kind of hard when you don't go to like school in the interest that you really are interested in, especially for journalists, because it's a very specific field. But I just started doing it in Savannah. I worked for the paper there, doing photography assignments and also writing articles and having some exhibits. And it just happened to become very good friends with the documentary photography professor at the Savannah College of Art and Design, because remember, that's where I was stationed, near there. And he actually recommended me, sounds so bad, but above his own students, for a internship with National Geographic, which I got. But I mean, it's not no like clear, easy way to like explain how I got to where I have been. But photography, photojournalism is really hard. Started working for FEMA as a FEMA disaster photographer as well. And when I moved back to New Orleans, working for the newspaper here, and until Ukraine, because I always would have a side personal project besides, like, you do your assignments, but your most powerful work is always going to be the stories that you want to tell yourself. So I had spent a lot of my personal time documenting the remaining commercial fishermen. I started actually in Savannah doing that, the shrimpers, the crabbers. And then I started doing it in New Orleans, where my mom is from, and my grandpa used to go fishing all the time down in the bayous here. So that's where I started. And I made a book out of that about Louisiana's vanishing fishing communities. That was a pretty cool photography book, with the oral history excerpts in it. I did it all with a film camera. It was really cool.
That is really cool.
Yeah.
And so then how did you get on Ukraine? Like, was your next project, did it like naturally come about to do like Ukraine and Iraq and Afghanistan?
Kind of. So I had always been really interested in getting into war photography. And some might say it's just like a soldier's adrenaline rush to go back to war. I don't know. But I had already had that interest for a long time. I had absolutely no idea how to break into it without having the degree and everything that goes along with the path of a journalist, especially a freelancer. So I ran into a West Point classmate in New Orleans at a Army-Navy football game. And about a year later, he told me he was going to Ukraine, because we were talking about going to Iraq together, because he was working on he's a builder of intentional communities. He does veteran-based projects, and he wanted to return to Iraq, to the former Yazidi village that needed support. in recovering from trauma. And he was interested in bringing me as his photographer. But instead of Iraq, he told me he was going to Ukraine. I had no idea anything about Ukraine, except that I sat across from a Ukrainian soldier in a mess tent in Iraq, and he looked like he was in a really bad mood. That's the only thing I knew about Ukraine. I'm like, Ukraine? At the time. And he was going with another veteran friend who was on a German Marshall Fund scholarship, helping Ukraine create a Ministry of Veterans Affairs, a VA, because they didn't have one, even though there was a war that began in 2014. So they invited me to go. Like, I was like, look, I'll document this event for you, because I knew this guy already had connections in Ukraine. And I knew that by going with him, he knew people I could talk to about going to the front line, which is what I really wanted to do. And that's where it began. And so I went, and when I started understanding these soldiers, that they were not the kind of soldiers that we imagine when we take the oath, we sign a contract, we get medical benefits, we're paid, we are sent to other people's lands. And then learning about Ukraine's war and this group of volunteer soldiers is what I'll call them. They were basically just men and women. When their official army did not respond to Russia's original invasion of Ukraine in 2014, they just hitchhiked. They took buses. They walked. They did everything. And they just self-deployed, and they literally saved their country. So that, to me, it just... for me, taking my camera and recording their stories and bringing attention to them and the war, it was kind of like my chance to go back to a war by my own calling, instead of because someone tells me that, like, you're going to Iraq to free Iraqis. Right. That's not what I really felt, but it was my own purpose to go and be there with them in their fight.
Yeah.
It was like a repurposed.
Yeah, and I'm sure it was really powerful, and because you wrote a book, a memoir. It's like a memoir / photojournalist, right?
There's no photos in it.
Oh, okay.
But it talks a lot about photography and ethics and propaganda. Yeah.
Okay. And one of the things is, like, you talked about, like, the commonality between combat veterans. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I think being there was this immediate, like, acceptance between their veteran community and their soldier community when I came. I mean, I just felt that I was at home. And it wasn't just because I was American. It was because of a shared, like, experience. Like, it doesn't matter what war you have fought in. We all share some of the exact same struggles, the same loves, the community that is brought together when the only thing you have to focus on is the person next to you and staying alive. Like, for some people in Afghanistan and Iraq, once, like, when you don't know really what your purpose is, you have one that is just to at least stay alive and keep your brothers alive. And I just went a little bit off. What am I answering again?
Oh, no. You were talking about the bond between
combat veterans. Yeah. And I do believe, even though their experience was so completely different and they, self-deployed in the beginning, I still saw some of the same dynamics of what does. I mean, I'm not sitting here trying to, like, promote revolutions and rebels, but there is something that once an established arc of leadership becomes more involved in politics, that we feel like it's not our purpose anymore. Once you're starting to be paid. But going back to my initial point of the connectedness between all combat veterans, if you imagine, I'm sure you've seen documentaries about our soldiers who have gone to, or Vietnam veterans, okay? And then Vietnam veterans from both sides, though. And there's, like, this moment that once we're removed from our combat, once we've had the space, it can't be in the midst of the war. But we actually can find that we have that shared experience, that where we don't care about race, about religion, about skin color, sexuality. Like when you're in these places together, and that kind of like carries with you a mentality, I think, through life after. In an elevator at the VA, there's a Vietnam veteran, there's a Korean War veteran, there's an Iraq veteran, and there's myself. All different colors, different cultures, upbringing, and everyone is just sitting in there just like this immediately, just from this shared experience. And I think that this is the same internationally. I really do. And I know that Ukraine is too much in the brunt of something really horrible right now, that they might not be able to see that because it's pretty awful. But there may be one day will be a day when they can even find that their combat history and a Russian veteran of the war might actually have some of those same regrets, hopes, experiences. Yeah. But I do think that once we get to that place in life, to see that we really have something that can shape us repurposing in life, something more powerful. Yeah. I don't know if I'm speaking correctly because I can't hear myself because I've.
Oh no, you're good. You're good. No, I mean, I think I'm just captivated because I'm like, yeah, like I'm. It's just so powerful to hear like that experience. It reminded me of being in the VA, and there was like some news clip about something happening in Israel, and it was like over a year ago, and like someone was like, that's not good for our like our military. And it was weird because around the room there was like this hush because we all knew what it meant in like such a deep personal way that and no one said anything, but you could feel it like around the room. Yeah. And it was like such a weird experience because it was like he just said that and we were kind of all thinking it, and then he said it out loud and everyone was like, oh my goodness. Oh, yeah. Like it just kind of like hit us.
Broke the ice. Yeah.
And so it just reminds me of like that shared experience, and like like especially when you talk about like the different sides and then coming together after the war, and like how similar, like we're more alike than we are different.
Yeah.
And especially like, if you get to the human aspect and not the like political high level.
Exactly, because soldiers are beyond politics, but unfortunately in war we have to serve under a politician, and we are expected to take orders and obey orders, and that's one thing that they all have in common, like just following orders, even though I do think there's a place to like argue some orders, but we are the same, but you can't really see the full picture until you're away from the war, and sometimes it's not until years and years later. Right. Talk about full circle. It's not just veterans all have this universal connection, but all wars are connected. For me, even being in Ukraine and suddenly seeing that here I am interviewing this former Soviet soldier who might have been in Afghanistan, but he's Ukrainian, like back in those days, I remember always thinking, this is, even though the word Soviet, everything is Russia when you would say Soviet, like it's, like Billy Joel, Russians in Afghanistan, remember we didn't start the fire. And I had these bayonets that I had bought. They were called Russian bayonets by the locals on base. And they were, Soviet bayonets. But just realizing that might have not necessarily belonged to a Russian soldier, but a Ukrainian soldier. That's like words, propaganda, media, even the role of journalism is so important because one little word can change ideas in people's minds.
Yeah.
And by the way, when I was in Ukraine is when this disaster happened in Afghanistan. And I was supporting and taking care of this. It's actually an amazing story, but these Afghan women were flight attendants in Kabul, which was a huge deal for them to be these working women. And when Kabul was taken over, they happened to be at the airfield because they were supposed to have a flight that day, but it ended up being that crazy moment. You remember seeing the footage of people running on the tarmac, but they actually just got onto an aircraft with the ladder, that had the stairs down. As people are running on with guns and running and trying to get away, and they're like to the pilot, you need to take off, you need to take off, you need to take off. So they actually served their jobs as flight attendants, and they got out on this documented flight that ended up going to Ukraine, and landing in Ukraine. And but just to see them there, the Soviets were in Afghanistan, and then we're in Afghanistan. And now, we have the Afghans running from the Taliban and ending up in Ukraine. And then they have to deal with Russia invading Ukraine, and they have to leave the country again a second time. running from war. But I just found the connection between those wars so fascinating.
Yeah.
It really brought it to life, but we ended up getting some of those. There were contractors on that flight too, and I ended up helping get their cases, got them to the United States. Okay. Afghan contractors that were helping our military.
Yeah. I've helped get people into the United States, contractors that I worked with, and it has not been a fast process, and it's been a little scary process because how long it's been taking to get the civ paperwork, and then it's really scary what's happening. And I think so much of the United States population is so far removed from it that they don't even they're not aware of what's happening, and they have no idea. So
and that's that's why I wrote the book too, hoping more people will read it, because it is all connected, and just because you don't see it doesn't mean that it's not going to turn around and affect you in a different way later. Because we all live on one planet. It's one planet.
And I'll say the title in the intro, but can you say the title? Because I think we just keep saying your book.
Sorry. It's called Snapshots Sent Home from Afghanistan, Iraq, Ukraine.
Yeah. So the link to order will be in the show notes. So if people want to pick it up, they can go grab it, and that would be awesome. And then is there anything from either your time in the military or your time since the military and the work that you're doing as a writer and photojournalist that you wanted to cover that we didn't get a chance to talk about?
I think I've talked a lot. My mouth is dry.
It's been a really great interview, and I've learned so much, and it just resonated with me, just hearing your story. So I'm really excited that I have a copy of your book. I just haven't had a chance to read it. So it's on my list. Yeah, I think I will too. But I always like to end the interview with advice for the next generation. So if there was someone considering joining the military, what advice would you give them?
If you do join the military, just always find the right purpose. Always listen to the people who have been there the longest. Be respectful of other cultures if you end up being sent into their home, into their country, and learn everything you can about it. And if you do join, it's you will become a changed person forever, and you will have a community that will stay with you forever. And that is the greatest part of it. I think that's what I can say.
Yeah. I mean, the people are really the best part of the military, and you are changed. I mean, it's a life-altering experience, and it changes your life. So
in a good way.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much for being a guest. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for writing your story down in a book that is very powerful and not something that I've seen anyone writing about. So I'm really looking forward to reading it. So
Cool. Thanks so much for having me again.